When an HOA tyrant tried to rule my backyard, I turned her own game against her with a fence, a lock, and a whole lot of petty justice. Watch how one epic showdown transformed a neighborhood. She was screaming like a banshee in a cocktail dress, drenched from head to toe, pounding on my pool gate like she was summoning Satan himself. But all I did was sip my lemonade, flip the page of my book, and turn up the Bluetooth speaker just enough to drown her out with the sound of Under the Boardwalk. Imagine the ultimate showdown where one man's patience turns into a masterclass in petty revenge against the most tyrannical HOA president you've ever heard of. That's how this tale of suburban warfare begins, leading to a crescendo of hilarious justice you won't believe. The sight of HOA Karen slipping on my pool tiles, soaked in stolen chlorine water, cursing me for locking the gate behind her after she trespassed into my backyard oasis, was worth every drop of patience I had saved up from 6 months of HOA tyranny. And the funniest part, she didn't even know I had already called the sheriff, who owed me a favor. But to understand how we got to this glorious crescendo of humiliation and petty justice, you have to start from the beginning when I made the unfortunate decision to buy a house in a neighborhood governed by the most passive-aggressive group of suburban dictators to ever wield a clipboard. I had just moved into Sycamore Heights, lured by its quiet cul-de-sacs, mature trees, and promise of peace after years of city chaos. But no one warned me about the HOA, especially not about Karen, the president, treasurer, secretary, and self-appointed moral compass of the neighborhood. She had the kind of face that looked like it had never truly smiled, just curved into disapproving grins, and the voice of a substitute teacher who hated her job. The first time I met her, she was already filing a violation against me for having a moving truck parked overnight. I hadn't even unpacked my coffee mugs when she appeared at my doorstep, pen in hand, clipboard against her chest like a riot shield, and said in her nasal tone, "You're already in violation, Mr. Jameson. We like to keep our neighborhood orderly." I had smiled, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. That clipboard was her weapon of mass annoyance. And over the next few weeks, I began collecting letters like a kid collecting trading cards. Except these weren't fun or valuable. One for not trimming my hedges evenly. Another for leaving my garbage bins out for an additional 42 minutes. But the moment that flipped the switch in my brain from tolerant homeowner to meticulous revenge artist was when she tried to tell me I couldn't build a fence around my pool. I had gotten the permits. I had met the city code. I even showed her the document. But she leaned in, eyes squinting like a villain about to monologue, and said, "Permits don't override HOA guidelines. Mr. Jameson, this is a community." A community? She meant dictatorship. And so began the war. She sabotaged my contractor by reporting noise violations anytime they so much as sneezed. She called tow trucks on my guests during my housewarming party. She even tried to fine me $500 for hanging wind chimes that she claimed created anxiety-inducing tones. The woman was a lunatic in pastel cardigans. I tried everything. Mediation meetings, polite emails, even baking cookies, but Karen didn't want peace. She wanted control. She wanted to remind everyone every day that she ran Sycamore Heights like a suburban mafia. So, I stopped playing defense. I read the HOA bylaws like it was scripture. I found the loophole she overlooked, the gray zone she feared, and I waited. The real chess match began when I noticed Karen had a habit of walking her little demon of a Shih Tzu past my yard every morning, letting it poop exactly on the border of my lawn. And I mean every single morning. So I installed a camera. Then I sent her a bill for $187 for lawn sanitation. She ignored it, so I escalated it with certified mail and threatened small claims court. She backed off for a week. That was my first win. But then, like a villain in a low-budget sequel, she came back worse. She installed a motion sensor on my front porch light, claiming it blinded passing drivers. She painted over my curb numbers for uniformity. She even threw HOA threats at my Amazon packages left too long on the porch. And yet she still believed herself untouchable. That arrogance would be her undoing. The moment she broke into my backyard, the one she said I couldn't fence, was the moment the story turned. I had finished installing a brand new saltwater pool complete with soft LED lighting, a sleek waterfall feature, and yes, an 8-foot privacy fence. Every inch was legal and every inspection had passed. But Karen couldn't stand it. From her second-floor guest room window, she had a partial view of my yard, and that drove her absolutely feral. So one Sunday while I was out running errands, she trespassed. She used her HOA master key. Yes, she had one. To sneak through the back gate and lay out on one of my loungers like it was a public beach. My neighbor Larry, a retired Navy guy with binoculars and a grudge, saw it all. He texted me a photo. That was my green light. I drove home, quietly locked the outer gate, turned off the pool heater to make the water icy, and waited. When Karen realized she couldn't get out, she started yelling first for help, then at me, then at the birds, then again at me. I pretended I couldn't hear. Let her sweat. But she didn't know I had something far more delicious planned, because parked in my driveway, as bold as ever, was her little blue Prius, illegally half over the property line. That's when I called my buddy Nate, who owned a fencing company and owed me a huge favor from a fishing trip gone wrong. I told him, bring the quick cement. The next 3 hours would be legendary. But before we get there, you need to see exactly how far she pushed me. This wasn't just about a pool. This was about months of insults, false violations, and petty cruelty. It was about standing up to someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. And if Karen thought she could walk into my yard, wade into my pool, and still walk out with her dignity, she clearly didn't know who she was messing with. It all started with a lemonade stand. Literally, a neighborhood kid named Tyler, maybe 8 years old, with a toothy grin and a misprinted Boss Baby t-shirt, had set up a little table 2 houses down from mine with a crooked sign that said, "Fresh, cold lemonade, 50 cents. It was the kind of innocent thing that should have made the neighborhood feel alive, like the old American dream still breathed in small moments. But Karen, armed with her clipboard and a brain hardwired for misery, saw a threat to order. She marched up to the stand, berated the poor kid for not having a temporary vendor permit, and called his parents demanding the stand be shut down. It was the first domino in a chain of events that made me realize Karen wasn't just annoying. She was dangerous in the way a squirrel with a hand grenade is dangerous. Small, unpredictable, and absolutely certain she's in the right. Tyler's mom, bless her, tried to be civil, even apologizing to Karen while her son teared up beside his half-melted cooler. That moment stuck with me. A kid trying to do something wholesome, crushed by a woman who thought bylaws mattered more than basic decency. And I knew with absolute clarity that I wasn't dealing with a garden-variety suburban busybody. I was dealing with someone who craved control like a vampire craves blood. That's when I started keeping a Karen folder. Every ridiculous warning, every bizarre email, every grainy printed photo of my recycling bin being visible from the street. I filed it all. I treated it like an investigation. A pattern emerged. She had a schedule. She had favorite targets. And she had allies. 3 other HOA board members who nodded along to everything she said like bobbleheads in beige polos. But I had something better than allies. I had neighbors tired of her nonsense. Larry, the Navy vet, was the first to come forward. He lived 2 doors down and kept to himself until one day Karen reported him for using a power tool without proper eye protection because she saw him sanding a bookshelf in his garage that crossed a line. He showed up at my door with a 6-pack of root beer and a USB full of security cam footage of Karen trespassing, including her adjusting my garbage can so she could photograph it slightly outside the enclosure. We laughed for 30 minutes straight watching her stage violation photos like some delusional director with a low-budget reality show. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. Slowly, others joined the fold. Janine, a single mom who Karen had fined for her Christmas lights being non-compliant with seasonal aesthetic, shared stories of harassment. Greg, a local teacher, had been called out for parking too symmetrically, which Karen claimed caused visual confusion. It was like she had a bingo card for petty infractions, and we were all squares waiting to be stamped. Still, none of us had a smoking gun, something that could put her in checkmate. That came one Thursday morning when Karen made her first mistake. She tried to get me fined for a car I didn't even own. I had parked my cousin's old van in my driveway for one single night, so he could pick up some tools he'd left at my place. It was a 2006 Ford dented but perfectly legal. Karen reported it as abandoned. Not only that, But she sent a letter to the HOA board suggesting it be towed without notice for presenting an image of decline. I snapped. I went full legal. I pulled county records, highlighted city ordinances, drafted a 17-page document with legal references, and submitted it to the HOA board. But I didn't stop there. I also included a clause that stated any board member who initiated enforcement outside of protocol could be held personally liable. It was beautifully worded, strategically threatening, and copied to all 38 homeowners in the neighborhood. The backlash was immediate. Karen tried to deny she wrote the complaint, but I had the original email forwarded by an anonymous source. Turns out even some of her own board were done covering for her. She went quiet for almost a week. For a moment, peace felt possible. That's when the pool incident happened. It was unthinkable to me that after everything, after being outmaneuvered and publicly challenged, Karen would still have the gall to sneak onto my property. But that's exactly what she did. Larry told me she waited until I left for my usual Sunday run. She slipped around the back alley, used her master HOA key. Yes, she had one for every common gate, and apparently one was copied for my yard from a time before the privacy fence and slid in like a serpent into paradise. She even brought a sun hat and a book, as if this was some spa she had booked. The audacity was Olympic level, but her arrogance blinded her. She didn't know I'd recently changed the lock on the side gate to a smart lock system synced to my phone. Once Larry texted me she was inside, I activated it. The gate clicked. She was locked in. I took my time getting back home. I made a detour to grab snacks. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I parked slowly, letting the sound of tires crunching gravel taunt her. She was at the gate, gripping the bars like a zoo animal, drenched from taking a dip, screaming about trespassing, which was laughable. I filmed her tantrum from the driveway. She screamed about false imprisonment, threatened to call the police, demanded an apology. I reminded her she had no right to be in my yard, that I had full camera evidence, and that technically she could be charged with breaking and entering. Her face shifted from rage to panic. I could see her calculating the consequences. Then she pivoted to threats. HOA complaints, lawsuits, smear campaigns. That's when I made my move. I asked casually, almost sweetly. You didn't happen to park across my property line again, did you? Her face twitched. I already knew she had. Her little blue Prius was half on my side, clearly marked by my new temporary landscaping flags. That was all I needed. I stepped inside and called Nate. Within the hour, he pulled up with cement posts and a grin so wide it belonged in a movie. Karen, still locked in the backyard, didn't know yet what I was doing in the front, but she would find out soon. I laid the groundwork, literally. We marked the property line, measured it twice, and began digging holes around her parked car just inches from the bumper. With quick-drying cement and pre-assembled fencing panels, we boxed her in, perfectly legal, perfectly justified. And just like that, Karen's car became a prisoner of her own entitlement. But even then, I wasn't finished. This was more than revenge. This was transformation. The HOA's tyrant had overplayed her hand, and now the entire neighborhood was watching. The whispers had turned to cheers, and the seeds of rebellion were sprouting. But the best part, Karen still thought she had one more move left, and I was counting on it. By the time the cement had dried around Karen's precious Prius, and the final panel of fencing was screwed into place, I could hear her voice rise several octaves from behind the backyard gate, where she was still trapped beside my pool like a sunburned peacock in distress. She alternated between dramatic pleas and venom-laced threats, her shrill voice bouncing off the stucco walls as I calmly brought out a folding chair, set it on the lawn, and opened a chilled bottle of root beer, waving politely in her direction without saying a word. Her confusion was delicious. She knew something was wrong, but she hadn't yet realized the scale of her predicament. That clarity struck her about 20 minutes later when she finally convinced herself I might cave and let her out. But then she saw the tops of the fence panels poking up through the front yard and bolted to the side gate in a fury. She rattled it, kicked it, and screamed until her voice cracked. "You fenced in my car," she shrieked, her face twisted with an indignation that made me chuckle into my drink. "You lunatic!
That's false imprisonment of property. I didn't answer. I didn't have to.
My phone buzzed with a message from Nate.
Panels are in. Concrete solid. Want to add a no trespassing sign for flair? I responded with a single word. Absolutely. It was poetic. This was the same woman who once threatened to fine a teenage girl for using pink chalk on the sidewalk.
The same woman who slapped a violation on a single mother for having a trampoline visible from the street. The same woman who thought rules only existed for others. And now, for the first time, the rules had caught up to her.
I left her there a little longer. It wasn't cruelty. It was symmetry.
I used the time to walk around the block where several neighbors were gathered near Larry's driveway, laughing and whispering as they traded stories.
Karen's outburst had become an event.
Someone had brought popcorn. Another neighbor, Maria, was filming from her upstairs window and live texting the entire saga to her sister in another state. It was the most united the street had felt in years. I didn't say much, just nodded, smirked, and walked back home where I finally mercifully opened the side gate and let Karen storm out. She stomped past me, trembling with rage, soaking wet and still barefoot, tracking wet footprints across my stone pavers like a scene from a low-budget horror film.
She didn't say thank you. Of course not. She just shouted, "This isn't over, Jameson. You're going to regret this."
And pointed a shaking finger in my face before she spun toward the front yard and froze.
That was when she saw it. Really saw it.
The clean wooden panels surrounding her car, the concrete foundation now hardened like a prison wall, and the tasteful black and white sign that read private property.
Do not enter. HOA board access revoked.
Her mouth opened, but no sound came out.
She looked like a malfunctioning robot.
Her hand flew to her purse, probably to grab her phone, but the panic on her face told me she had left it inside her car.
And her keys. Of course, she had. She whirled around. Move it now. This is illegal. I sighed and crossed my arms. Actually, Karen, you're parked illegally across my property line. City records show it. I even reflagged the boundary. So, technically, I'm well within my rights to fence off my own land. You left your vehicle there without permission. That makes it abandoned property. You're insane.
She screeched, now pulling at the fence gate like it would magically collapse from her fury.
The HOA will have you evicted.
Not unless they call an emergency vote, I said, leaning casually against the post. And considering most of them saw what you did and are kind of enjoying this, I wouldn't count on it.
That part was true. I'd already received 5 emails from neighbors expressing their gratitude and support.
Some even offered to help maintain the fence if I kept it up as a monument to justice.
But Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning, she showed up at the HOA office looking like a raccoon who had lost a court battle. Hair frizzed, eyes wild, voice booming as she demanded an emergency meeting. She tried to spin the story, claimed I had built the fence overnight without warning that I had locked her inside my pool and caused her psychological trauma. But people weren't buying it. Larry had already shared the footage. Janine printed it and passed it around like flyers at a protest. Greg added a time-stamped report of when she had entered my yard. Her narrative unraveled like cheap thread, and with every second she realized it, but she clung to one last move, appealing to the bylaws. She claimed I had failed to submit a fencing modification request. What she didn't know was that I had already filed it 2 days prior out of pure spite and preemptive brilliance, and it had been marked as received by the HOA secretary, Beth, who had finally come over to our side after Karen accused her of unprofessional penmanship in last month's meeting. Beth produced the paperwork with a gleam in her eye and said, "Looks valid to me." Karen's meltdown was immediate. She ranted, raved, even slapped her hand on the table and called the rest of the board spineless cowards. But they weren't cowards. They were just free for the first time in years. Free from her threats, her intimidation, her endless stream of complaint. And now that someone had stood up and fought back and filmed every second of it, they had an excuse to finally pull the plug. By the end of the meeting, an emergency vote was called, not to evict me,
but to suspend Karen's authority until further review. She stormed out of the room like a cartoon villain, denied her monologue while I stayed behind, sipped complimentary coffee, and listened to Beth explain the appeal process with a grin that said she hoped Karen would try.
That evening, Karen tried one more desperate play. She returned to the scene, this time with a city inspector. She had apparently bribed with cupcakes and charm. She pointed at my fence, gesturing wildly, trying to convince him I was violating setback code.
But the inspector, a guy named Dennis with tired eyes and a folder full of building permits, simply raised an eyebrow and said, "Actually, everything's compliant."
Jameson even added 5 extra inches to the buffer zone. You might want to check your parking habits, though. Karen stood there stunned as if language itself had betrayed her.
She didn't speak, just turned and walked off, keys jingling weakly in her hand.
Her Prius, still fenced in, sat like a trapped animal under the moonlight. And for once, she didn't try to fight. She just laughed. As I stood there watching her retreat, I realized something important. It was never really about the pool or the fence or even the car. It was about dignity, about someone so consumed with control, so drunk on petty power that she forgot what community actually meant. She thought fear would protect her. She thought rules were weapons. But all it took was one person to call her bluff. And the ripple was spreading because this story, our story, wasn't over. Not yet. Karen had one last card to play. And I was ready to burn the whole deck if I had to. I should have known Karen wouldn't accept defeat with grace. That wasn't in her nature. She wasn't wired for humility or introspection. She was wired for revenge, for vindication, for the kind of petty victories that made her feel like she still ran the world with nothing but a clipboard and the imaginary authority of a neighborhood rulebook. So when she vanished for 2 full days, I didn't take it as surrender. I took it as warning. The calm before a storm that I knew would smell like hairspray, printer ink, and desperation. I spent those days reinforcing the fence, checking my cameras, making sure every permit and document was in pristine order. I even installed a secondary lock on the side gate, and had my friend Nate bring in gravel to mark a visual boundary around the car in case she tried to claim confusion about the property line again. I documented everything, timestamped every image, and made sure I had 5 different backups across drives, cloud storage, and Larry's old military hard drive that could probably survive a nuclear blast. I wasn't just bracing for an argument. I was bracing for legal warfare. It came at 9:12 a.m. on a Thursday in the form of a manila envelope delivered by a woman in oversized sunglasses and way too much perfume. Inside was a formal notice. Karen had filed a lawsuit. Civil trespass, emotional distress, unauthorized construction on shared neighborhood frontage, defamation of character, and my personal favorite, malicious entrapment. She claimed the entire incident had been orchestrated by me to publicly humiliate her and discredit her position on the HOA board. She even listed emotional trauma and sleep disruption as damages. Her legal argument was thinner than a dollar store napkin, but it had enough buzzwords to buy her time and nuisance leverage. That's how people like Karen fought. Not with truth or evidence, but with threats, paperwork, and the hope that someone would give up out of exhaustion. What she didn't count on was that I had more time, more patience, and a much deeper well of pettiness than she ever imagined. I called my lawyer, a guy named Ethan, who used to specialize in HOA disputes before realizing it was more lucrative to defend the people being harassed by them. He laughed so hard when he read the suit, he nearly dropped his bagel. Then he said, "Want to counterclaim and make her regret ever learning how to spell litigation?" I didn't just want to. I needed to. So, we did. Ethan drafted a response that tore her claims to shreds, complete with every violation she had committed over the past 6 months, footage from 3 different neighbors, documentation of unauthorized entry, and a precise timeline showing how she accessed my property and parked her car in violation of municipal code. We attached a modest counterclaim for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, property interference, and an HOA abuse of authority. Ethan's closing line in the brief read, "Plaintiff's claims are as structurally unsupported as her moral compass." I nearly framed it. The moment the court date was confirmed, the neighborhood buzzed like a beehive poked with a stick.
People who had never spoken to each other were suddenly exchanging Karen horror stories in driveways, at the mailbox, and in a neighborhood Facebook group that had quietly changed its name from Sycamore Heights Harmony to Free the Fence. Karen responded with a new wave of HOA memos, this time citing bylaws so outdated they still referred to fax machines. She demanded inspections, tried to rally support from the 3 remaining board members still loyal to her, and even tried to have my mailbox audited for non-standard tilt.
No one bit. She was spiraling and everyone saw it. The final nail came from an unexpected source.
One evening, as I was adjusting the motion sensors in the front yard, an older woman with a cane and the expression of someone who had once slapped sense into senators walked up my driveway.
Her name was Patricia.
She'd lived in the neighborhood for 22 years and had been one of the founding members of the HOA before retiring in what she described as exhausted disgust. She handed me a small black folder and said, "Thought you might want to see how she got on the board in the first place." Inside was gold proof that Karen had manipulated a proxy vote during a low-attendance HOA meeting 5 years ago, installing herself as president with forged signatures from absentee homeowners. It wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. Patricia had kept the documents out of fear, but told me, "You're the first one who stood up to her and lived to tell the tale.
Might as well finish the job."
I passed the file to Ethan, who added it to the counterclaim and notified the city's housing department. By the time the court date arrived, Karen was a shadow of her former self. She still wore her pastel blazer, still carried her infamous clipboard like a security blanket, but the fire behind her eyes was dimmed. She was nervous, panicked even. The courtroom was modest, no grand drama, no jury box, just a judge with a tight schedule, a few rows of chairs, and about 15 curious neighbors who had shown up under the pretense of civic interest. Ethan presented our case like a surgeon with a scalpel, clean and methodical. Every point backed by photos, footage, witness statements, and enough sarcasm to keep the judge raising his eyebrows. Karen's lawyer tried to object, fumbled through papers, mispronounced my name 3 times, and visibly winced when the judge asked him to clarify the logic behind malicious entrapment by recreational installation. By the end of the day, the suit was dismissed and our counterclaim was scheduled for a damages hearing. Karen had lost, but even more painful for her, she had lost publicly. People applauded when the judge left the room. No one clapped for her, not even her lawyer.
Outside, reporters from a local community paper asked for a statement. I declined, but Larry didn't. He smiled for the camera and said, "Justice tastes better than lemonade." Karen rushed past, face flushed with humiliation, muttering threats to no one in particular.
But her reign was broken. Her clipboard was just cardboard now. And as she climbed into a rental car, because her Prius was still boxed in, waiting for a release form she'd refused to request, I realized this war had become something bigger than me. It had become the neighborhood's turning point, and Karen's last desperate moves would soon lead to a collapse she couldn't escape. Not from me, not from the board, not from the very people she once ruled over with petty fines and passive-aggressive memos, because her empire was crumbling, and I hadn't even played my final card yet.
There's a funny thing that happens when you beat someone like Karen at their own game.
At first they recoil like a startled cat, humiliated, furious, temporarily stunned. But then they start plotting, not intelligently, not strategically, but with that same manic energy of someone who refuses to acknowledge their own failure. That was the phase Karen had now entered, scorched earth mode. The day after her court defeat, she began her most erratic campaign yet. I woke up to find tiny printouts of HOA violation slips taped all over my fence, mailbox, trash cans, even on the hood of my truck. They were laughably invalid, printed on off-white paper with faded ink and citations that didn't even exist in the updated bylaws. One of them accused me of inappropriate holiday decor despite it being early May. Another accused me of aggressive grass patterns, whatever that meant. It was like she had thrown logic into a blender with old copies of the HOA manual and hit puree. I didn't take them down. I left every single one up, turned them into decorations. Larry came by and stuck googly eyes on a few. Kids from the neighborhood started calling it the Karen Wall, and took selfies next to it. I even saw a teenager make a TikTok about it, complete with dramatic violin music and mock narration. Every attempt she made to reassert her authority only deepened the spectacle. It would have been pitiful if it weren't so entertaining.
But then she escalated. She began making anonymous calls to the city's code enforcement office. Noise complaints, waste management violations. She even claimed my dog was unlicensed, which was fascinating since I didn't own a dog. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but the pattern was obvious. Karen was trying to drown me in bureaucracy. Her tactic was simple. If she couldn't win with truth or law, she'd win by exhausting me. Unfortunately for her, I thrived in the chaos she created. Every time a city inspector showed up, I greeted them with coffee and a folder of neatly labeled documents. Most of them were embarrassed to even be there. And one of them, a tall guy named Rudy, admitted after his third visit that he'd seen this sort of thing before. Control freaks with fragile egos, he said, shaking his head. They get louder when they're losing, but eventually they burn out or get burned. I smiled and handed him a fresh printout of Karen's fraudulent HOA notices. Just helping the process, I said. But even with the legal win, even with the neighborhood siding against her, Karen wasn't letting go. She called an emergency HOA meeting, her final attempt to claw back relevance. Only 6 people showed up and 4 of them came just to watch the firework. She stood at the podium in the community clubhouse like a deposed queen, her voice brittle but trembling with defiance. "This neighborhood is falling into disrepair," she said, slamming her folder down as if it contained evidence of mass corruption. "We have rogue elements, mockery of authority, blatant abuse of decorative freedom." Decorative freedom. She actually said that. I almost choked on my water. Beth, the secretary, leaned over and whispered, "She's gone full Shakespearean villain." The others nodded solemnly. Karen went on to propose a motion to remove me from the neighborhood's social group, restrict my access to common spaces and ban further construction on my property unless personally approved by her. The silence after her speech was so heavy it might have flattened a weaker person. No one moved. No one seconded the motion. Then finally, Greg raised his hand, not to support, but to ask a simple question. "Karen, who gave you the authority to call this meeting?" Her face twisted, uncertain. "I'm the board president." "Suspended president," Beth corrected, tapping the minutes with her pen. "Pending investigation. Remember?" Karen tried to backpedal, accusing everyone in the room of mutiny, of undermining neighborhood unity, of conspiring with me to destabilize the HOA. That's when Janine stood up and said something no one expected. "We should just vote," she said. "Right now. No more of this." Everyone turned. "Vote on what?" Karen snapped. "On removing you," Janine replied calmly. "From the board for good. You've abused your position, forged documents, created conflict. You're the reason this community is so divided." Karen scoffed, trying to laugh it off, but her eyes were darting around the room now, searching for support and finding none. One by one, people raised their hands. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even hostile. It was quiet, muted, final. Beth recorded the votes and announced the result. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. Her clipboard hit the podium with a clatter that echoed like a church bell at a funeral. She didn't speak. She just picked it up, turned around, and walked out the door, her shoes clicking like a metronome, marking the death of her empire. That should have been the end of it. But Karen didn't just fade into the background. She couldn't. That weekend, I noticed her Prius was finally gone, presumably released after she swallowed her pride and signed the necessary forms. But in its place, she left something else. A fake construction sign planted in the middle of my yard reading "Unpermitted Structure Zone. Demolition pending." It was laminated. She had laminated it. I laughed for 20 minutes before calling the city. The sign was removed by noon. But that wasn't all. She began posting flyers around the neighborhood, accusing me of destroying community values, manipulating the HOA, even running an underground fence installation racket. The flyers were printed in Comic Sans. It was like watching someone perform their own public self-destruction, one ridiculous act at a time. But despite all of it, part of me stayed alert because someone like Karen didn't go down with just embarrassment. No,
I knew she had one last trick, something desperate and stupid.
And I was right.
One morning, I walked out to find a notice taped to my front door.
This one bearing the logo of a property development firm.
According to the letter, Karen had attempted to file a claim stating that my land contained a public utility easement, which, if true, could subject it to legal disputes and force removal of structures like fences. It was a low blow, one that required legal gymnastics and blind greed to even attempt, but it was enough to trigger another inspection.
Ethan was already on it.
Within a day, he uncovered emails Karen had sent using an outdated plat map from the 1980s, one that had long since been voided by updated zoning. It was an obvious scam, but it meant Karen had gone from nuisance to outright fraud.
And that changed everything.
The wheels were now in motion, not just for community pushback, but for formal legal action, real consequences, fines, possibly worse.
The neighborhood wasn't just watching anymore.
They were participating. People were forwarding emails, reporting her, refusing to speak to her when she passed. She was alone, cornered, and still too stubborn to walk away. I stood at the edge of my lawn that evening, watching the sun drop behind the rooflines, and thought about how it all began. The final fuse came exactly 5 days after her removal from the HOA board at 3:47 in the morning, when the sound of metal grinding against pavement yanked me from sleep.
At first, I thought it was a raccoon going to war with my trash can again.
But then I heard the steady beep of something in reverse, followed by a sudden, unmistakable crunch. I threw on my robe, grabbed my phone, and stepped onto the porch just in time to see Karen, unhinged and wildeed, trying to drag the temporary fence panels away from where her Prius had once been imprisoned. She had loaded them into a rusted trailer hitched to the back of a rental pickup truck she definitely did not own. Her movements were frantic, panicked, her face red with exertion as she struggled to yank the concrete footings loose, clearly unaware that quick-set cement doesn't yield to brute force.
She hadn't even brought gloves.
One of her hands was already bleeding. There was a pile of broken tools beside her, bolt cutters, a garden trowel, even what looked like a hammer wrapped in duct tape. She saw me, froze for a moment like a deer in the headlights, then had the audacity to shout, "This is illegal. You have no right to block public access to this section of land."
She actually said that at 4 o'clock in the morning while stealing private property. I didn't say anything.
I just tapped the camera icon on my phone and began recording.
Her expression changed immediately.
She dropped one of the fence posts and stormed toward me. Her voice rising, accusing me of harassment, entrapment, coercion, and some other words she clearly didn't understand. "This neighborhood is dying because of people like you," she shrieked, gesturing wildly at nothing.
You think you're clever? You think you've won? This is bigger than just a fence, Jameson. This is about restoring order.
I calmly pointed at the pile of fence pieces loaded into her trailer.
That's my property, Karen. And this is theft.
You stole from me first, she spat. You fenced my car.
You humiliated me.
You broke into my yard and trespassed into my pool, I said, not raising my voice. You parked illegally on my land. You filed false complaints.
You forged documents. Shall I continue?
She hesitated, wavering between rage and realization that she was being filmed and probably incriminating herself. Then she did the one thing I didn't expect. She picked up the hammer, looked me in the eye, and swung it, not at me, but at the mailbox next to my gate. She struck it hard 3 times until the metal bent and the wooden post cracked at the base.
There, she panted, breathless, eyes burning. Now we're even.
It was almost sad, but not enough to stop me from calling the police. When the squad car arrived 20 minutes later with flashing lights and an officer I recognized from a previous code enforcement visit, Karen had already slumped to the ground beside the trailer, her hands shaking, her knees scraped from where she had fallen, trying to yank another concrete block. The officer took one look at the damage, at the tools, at the fence panels in her trailer, then at me still recording from my porch inside. "You again," he said to Karen. "Didn't we just have this talk?" She muttered something about being provoked, about community justice, about constitutional rights.
The officer turned to me. "Do you want to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. "Absolutely.
She was cuffed gently, as if the officer was used to detaining people who still thought they were in charge. As she was led to the car, she screamed every insult she could muster, calling me a fraud, a manipulator, a criminal mastermind.
One neighbor poked their head out to see the commotion. Another came out with a phone and began filming, too. The final humiliation wasn't being arrested.
It was being arrested in front of the very people she once ruled. Her empire of lawn rules and mailbox heights crumbled as she was placed in the back seat and driven away into the early morning light. It would have made for a great ending. But the story didn't stop there, because with Karen gone, the neighborhood entered a phase of cautious optimism, like a city rebuilding after a long and ridiculous dictatorship.
The HOA board held an open meeting the following weekend. Outdoors, public, no clipboards allowed. They voted to revise the community bylaws, stripping out Karen's weird additions like seasonal decor neutrality and plant symmetry enforcement.
Beth was nominated as the new president. Greg agreed to serve as treasurer. And for the first time in recorded HOA history, the entire meeting ended with laughter instead of threat.
People brought cookies. Someone set up a coffee table. Larry brought folding chairs.
I just watched from my yard, smiling at the sight of normalcy returning. But the true poetic justice came 3 weeks later, when a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Karen at her home address.
Except it wasn't her home anymore.
Turns out her arrest had triggered a background investigation that revealed multiple HOA violations and fraudulent activity over the years. She had pending tax issues, undisclosed funds in the HOA account, and questionable purchases that couldn't be explained. Her removal had opened the door to a full audit, and once it began, the financial skeletons came tumbling out like a Halloween display gone rogue.
The letter wasn't meant for her anymore.
It was from a legal firm representing the HOA, notifying her of formal charges and a demand for restitution, and I, having once been the target of her vendetta, was asked to testify.
I agreed without hesitation. The hearing was uneventful.
Her lawyer tried to argue mental duress, claimed she had been pushed to the edge by public ridicule and unfair targeting, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge sided with the HOA, ordering her to repay thousands in misused funds and banning her from holding any official position in any neighborhood association for the next 10 years. She didn't even show up in person, just phoned in from another town 2 hours away, where rumor had it she was renting a small apartment and trying to start a neighborhood improvement committee that no one had joined. I left the courthouse that day with a calm I hadn't felt since moving to Sycamore Heights. The fence still stood, not just as a boundary, but as a monument to stubborn justice. The pool sparkled under the sun, untouched by trespassers. The mailbox was repaired, stronger than before, and the clipboard that once symbolized tyranny was now just a joke people whispered about during block parties. Karen had become a cautionary tale. Not a villain to be feared anymore, but a name people used when their kids acted out.
Don't go full Karen, they'd say. You don't want to end up fenced in. I never set out to be a neighborhood hero. I just wanted peace. But sometimes peace only comes when someone decides enough is enough. When you out-stubborn the tyrant.
When you build the fence, lock the gate, let them yell, and then laugh as the echoes fade into nothing. Summer in Sycamore Heights used to be something I dreaded. Not because of the heat or the mosquitoes, but because of the constant low-level stress that came with living under the rule of a clipboard-wielding tyrant who thought she was queen of suburbia. But that summer, the first after Karen's downfall, the neighborhood felt like it had taken its first real breath in years. People walked with their shoulders relaxed. Kids played in the sprinklers without fear of receiving a passive-aggressive violation for unauthorized water discharge. Even the birds seemed louder, freer. Maybe it was just in my head, but I could swear the sun felt warmer now that it wasn't being filtered through the toxic fog of HOA micromanagement. My mornings had become sacred. I'd wake up, make a strong cup of coffee, and sit on the porch with my feet up, watching neighbors wave on their way to work. Larry would sometimes wander over, newspaper under his arm, grumbling about crossword puzzles, or asking if I had any spare batteries. Beth, now the beloved HOA president, had become a beacon of quiet efficiency. Meetings were shorter, friendlier, and refreshingly free of words like escalation or non-compliance, and my fence still standing proud and pristine. I cleaned it weekly. It had gone from being a barrier to a symbol.
People still walked by just to take pictures with it.
One neighbor made little wooden replicas and started selling them online as Karen keepers.
I bought one and placed it on my mantle.
But while the neighborhood celebrated its newfound sanity, I kept a cautious eye on the horizon. You don't survive a Karen siege without learning to expect one last surprise, one final gasp from the villain who refuses to go quietly. And it came in the form of a realtor. A sleek, suited man knocked on my door one afternoon with a dazzling smile and a business card that smelled like ambition.
He said he was representing a buyer, a very interested, very motivated buyer. The offer was generous, ridiculously so.
Way above market value, all cash, short close, no inspection required. That alone was suspicious.
I asked who the buyer was.
He said the name was confidential.
I told him I didn't sell to ghosts.
He laughed and said he understood, but hinted that the buyer had once lived nearby and was hoping for a fresh start.
I didn't even need to guess.
I told him politely that the property wasn't for sale.
Not now, not ever, not to her. The agent didn't push.
He nodded, scribbled something in his leather folder, and left without argument. But the seed had been planted.
Karen wanted back in.
After everything, she still thought she could return and reclaim some piece of the world she had lost. Maybe she thought enough time had passed.
Maybe she assumed people had forgotten. Maybe she believed money could buy forgiveness.
But Sycamore Heights had changed. We had changed. We were no longer the quiet, intimidated cluster of homeowners afraid to challenge the almighty HOA queen.
We had stood up, fought back, and won.
And even if she somehow found a way to sneak back in, she'd never get her throne again. Still, I decided to double-check a few things. I called the HOA, confirmed with Beth that any property transfer would trigger a full review and reminded her that Karen was banned from holding any position of power in our district. Then I posted a casual message in the community forum. Just a friendly update about recent property inquiries and a little reminder about our shared values.
The comments lit up. Everyone knew what I was saying without me saying it. People started putting signs in their windows. We remember no more Karens.
One guy put up a scarecrow holding a clipboard and labeled it HOA Zombie Queen.
It was stupid. It was hilarious.
It was perfect.
Karen never moved back.
Whether it was the signs, the refusal, or just a final burst of self-awareness, she vanished once more from our lives. No more mysterious cars, no more fake inspections, no more letters tucked into bushes.
Peace finally settled in like sunlight after a long storm.
But the story didn't end in silence.
It ended in celebration. That fall, the neighborhood held its first ever Block Freedom Festival.
There were food trucks, music, face painting, even a dunk tank featuring a cardboard cutout of Karen that Larry had custom made.
I donated pool access for the day.
And the same gate she once rattled in frustration now swung open to welcome laughter and cannonballs. We raffled off Freedom Fence keychains and passed around stories of old HOA horrors like veterans swapping war tales. One elderly couple admitted they had once been too scared to put up wind chimes because Karen claimed they interfered with migratory patterns.
We laughed until we cried.
It was more than a party.
It was healing.
That night, as the music faded and lanterns flickered along the sidewalks, I found myself standing at the edge of my yard, drink in hand, watching neighbors dance in the street. For the first time since moving here, I felt not just at home, but part of something, a real community. Not the kind enforced by bylaws and fines, but the kind built by shared battles, stubborn resilience, and mutual respect. Larry shuffled up beside me, offered a tired smile, and said, "You know, if you ever run for mayor of this place, I'd vote for you."
I laughed. I think I've had enough politics for one lifetime. He nodded.
Still, you did something no one else could.
You took on the clipboard queen and lived to tell the tale.
I looked around at the lights, the people, the fence, and I realized he was right. This whole thing had started with a woman who couldn't mind her own business and a man who just wanted to enjoy his backyard in peace. But in the end, it had become something much larger. A movement, a rebellion, a reminder that bullies only win if you let them. And that sometimes the best way to win isn't by shouting louder, but by outsmarting them, outlasting them, and yes, fencing them in when the moment is just right. As the night deepened and the festival wound down, I sat by the pool one last time, legs dangling in the water, reflecting on every ridiculous, infuriating, and hilarious moment that had led us here. I thought about Karen's face when she realized the fence wasn't coming down. I thought about the first violation letter she ever handed me, so smug and precise. And I thought about how satisfying it felt to build something she could never control. The gate was still locked, but now it was locked from the inside. My choice, my home, my rules. The clipboard was gone. The kingdom was free, and I finally could swim in peace.